Hello and welcome. My name is Bryson Bort. I am the founder and CEO at SCYTHE, and I am joined by Professor Mary Aiken on today's episode of Cyberpsychology, the human cognitive element in defense and offense. Mary, if you would like to kick off with an introduction of yourself for our audience.
Sure, Bryson, thanks. I'm Mary. I'm a professor of forensic cyberpsychology at the University of East London, and I'm professor and chair of the Department of Cyberpsychology at Capital Tech University in Washington, D.C. And I'm also a strategic advisor and chief scientist safety tech at Paladin Capital, which is how we met, Bryson, which is leading US cyber VC.
So, what is cyber psychology? We talk so much about cybersecurity, cyber physical systems. Cyber psychology, what's that?
Cyber psychology is an advanced discipline within applied psychology. So it's the study of the impact of technology on human behavior. And my specialist area is forensic cyberpsychology, which is the study of criminal, abnormal, and harmful behavior online.
And what can we do with that? I know that there's a lot of emotion when it comes to cybersecurity. I'd like to point out this is a discipline that is unsolved, and that's where we get the joke that will always be employed because we'll never solve it. But where I always see the emotional psychology is one, from a defender perspective, the fight against the perimeter is dead. I can keep them out. And so I need to have confidence that I can keep the masked intruder away. And so we have emotion driving business decisions in the portfolio that's being stood up for defense. The other area where I see emotions are in hacking back, right? I want to get them. And so that's where we get into like the letters of marquee and those ideas. So how does cyber psychology tie into this?
Well, the thing is that we've had 50 or 60 years of cybersecurity, and cybersecurity protects your data, your systems, your devices. It does not protect what it is to be human online. Therein lies the gap. So the point is that, what we know is the vast majority of cyber attacks, in the 90th percentiles, are actually fueled by social engineering. Social engineering has everything to do with psychology and very little to do with technology. And that's really where cyber psychology steps up. The specialist area of cyber psychology that I'm involved in, I suppose you could describe it as operational cyber psychology, and then in some cases, offensive cyber psychology. So if you think about the premise of like differentiating, what we've seen in terms of the inability of traditional cybersecurity practice to protect humans, and that's human as user and human as operator, so consumer and operator. So what we've seen worldwide is this sort of growing movement in terms of trying to sort of factor the human into the protection strategy. And we've seen worldwide the growth of interest in the area of online harm. So the UK was the first country to really conceptualize this spectrum of harm, which lies adjacent to cybersecurity. And that spectrum of harm ranges from bullying through to harassment, through to mis and disinformation, through to cyber fraud. So all of the things that are sort of targeting the human. And, we've seen, say, the UK introduce the Online Safety Act, which is now formalizing, protecting humans in cyber contexts. We see the EU Digital Services Directive. And what you see in the US is sort of a state-by-state attempt to target various issues. So what does that mean to cybersecurity? Well, the point is that you've got two silos sitting beside each other. You've cybersecurity and technologies lying under the CISO, if you will. And then parallel to that, you have a whole lot of areas like legal and HR and brand reputation management that really sit under the operational part of a business and sits under the COO. And the point is, like, we're pretty good at defending the cybersecurity silo, using the latest technologies. But over on the other side of the business, what you might call like the softer side, the fuzzy side, you've got lots of opportunity there for attack and very little technology deployed in that silo that is going to protect from that socially engineered attack and tacking into the vulnerability of an enterprise. And arguably, the early warning attacks will happen in that silo, the silo that is, the brand reputation management, the softer side of the business, rather than a hard attack on a well-defended network. So that's sort of one point. The second point, when you say we can defend the network, well, unfortunately, that's not enough, because there is little or no deterrent value in simply defending. There's no deterrent in terms of when you stop at the perimeter of your network. Now, to date, clearly you can't launch a counterattack, like a digital forensic, even where attribution might be certain, much as you might want to.
I want to double down on that. You heard it here from another professional. You can't do that.
Just in case we get confused. But the real gap in the knowledge and the exciting, sort of breakthrough is that IARPA, which is twinned with DARPA and is the US Intelligence Research Agency, they just launched an initiative titled Rescind, which is reimagining security with cyberpsychology informed network defense. So what does that mean? They spotted this opportunity gap. We all agree you cannot hack back, because that in itself is a criminal offense, then you would be committing a cyber crime. However, you can psychologically hack back. And this is just such a big breakthrough. And as you psychologically hack back, and then I can explain what that means, what it means is you are pursuing the perpetrator beyond the perimeter of the network. And arguably, that has deterrent value. And the point is that our whole social justice system is based on the premise of deterrence. So if there's no consequence for behavior, if people are just merely in defense mode, then we're not going to actively deter cyber attackers. And that's why this sort of breakthrough is so important.
Sorry, I'm looking through a lot of the questions. We have some great conversation going on there. And we have one: why do hackers or adversaries do cyber attacks in the first place? And I don't, I mean, that puts you a little bit on the spot on that, but I can tell you,
Sure.
I've seen two frameworks that speak to this that I think are interesting. One that Josh Corman talks a lot about gets into the different kinds of psychological motivations, from prestige to fame to money. The second, which I think is related because it isn't always an individual psychology, because cybersecurity is also the application of military and intelligence operations as well. And that would be where, so all of a sudden blanking in his name, out of Colombia. I could see his face. I could see his little mustache, and I can't remember his name all of a sudden. Starts with a J. And he talks about a framework of essentially state support for hacking operations. But Mary?
So if you look at, the threat actors, so, before we talk about motivation, first of all, you have to identify threat actors, and there's quite a range. Okay, so you go from state sponsored to state condoned. You have activists, you have hacktivists, you've rampant organized cybercrime. And then, you've got your sophisticated threat actors. And so you've a full spectrum of people who might engage in cyber attacks. And you can't apply a broad motivation to all. So your state-sponsored or state-condoned might be more politically focused in terms of motivation. Your organized cyber criminals, well, they're clearly not, working on any principle of idealism. They're clearly in it for profit. So, and then when you get into sophisticated threat actors, you can have other motives like revenge bubbling up. So it's a very complex area when you start to try to break down the threat actors and then individual motives. And then when you go past motive, you get into personality traits and characteristics that are very specific to cyber attackers. And that's, a lot of the research is based on what you might call, the hacker prototype. What's your prototypical personality profile, psychological drivers of the person who wants to illegally penetrate a network in terms of a hack, if you will. And what we see there is, again, a wide spectrum of traits. So you've got drivers, and this would tend to sort of, focus more on, say, juvenile, would be, for example, a basic driver might be curiosity. And they may engage in behavior that penetrates a network, but do so accidentally in terms of they're curious, they're tech talented, and they may not be fully aware of the line between what you can do and the point at which it becomes a cybercrime. And that in itself is a problem. We've got generations of kids growing up where their parents and their teachers are not technologically knowledgeable enough to actually help them, draw that line. Then you get into areas like impulsivity and compulsivity. So we see that sort of as, hacker traits. And that's interesting in terms of creating what you might call, sort of a profile or a behavioral profiler. We also see addictive type behaviors. Now, when I say addictive type, the reason I can't say classic addiction, although I would argue it's a classic addiction, is that DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the APA, doesn't recognize internet addiction, technology addiction, smartphone addiction. Bizarre, but true. Probably because when they published the latest version of DSM, it was in 2013. When they started the call for what should be included in that, in terms of the 10 years that goes into, DSM, it's the sort of the guide that decides what a clinical addiction is or not, and any form of technology addiction, apart from a tipping of the hat to gaming addiction, doesn't exist in that for psychologists. That's why we can't say smartphone addiction, although it clearly exists. And the call went out in the year 2000. So for 10 years, they did the paperwork on what should be addiction or not, and then it was included, which sort of completely predates smartphones, predates social media as we know it now. So that's a science problem. So let's talk about addictive type behaviors in terms of a motivation to engage in hacking. And then you've got peer pressures and kudos and, being the guy, which you see, which is another common trait, or the girl, let's be equal here, in hacker communities. So you've got this complex matrix of individual behaviors, and then you've complex matrix of motivations, and then you've got a complex matrix of threat actors. So it's, and that's what I do in terms of cyber behavioral profiling, is try to, make sense of that in a scientific context. But coming back to IARPA, so IARPA, in cyber psychology, a lot of the work that I've done in this area, which is called online safety technologies or safety tech, which is this sort of silo that sits parallel to cybersecurity. If we say that we want our systems to be robust, resilient, safe, and secure. Equally, we want the people who use and operate those systems to be psychologically robust, resilient, safe, and secure. And it's the combination of two. So it's a combination of this broad area of cyber safety, and particularly online safety technology and cybersecurity. It's the combination of the two that delivers 360 resilience. And Paladin, the VC that I work with, they've really stepped up, well, only because also I put a lot of pressure on them to fund research into these reports. There's a great report that we published called Towards a Safer Nation. We published it in 2022, which really was the first report that established the US online safety technology or safety tech sector. And here's the kicker, by creating a new sector that's dedicated to cyber safety, and running that in parallel to the cybersecurity sector, what you're doing is in stimulating this cyber safety sector to develop technology solutions to technology facilitated criminal, harmful, and problematic behavior. What you're doing is you're driving innovation, you're creating jobs, you're building businesses, and at the same time, you're solving complex socio-tech problems. So this is the important thing, is to get these two sectors working together to try and to deliver 360 resilience.
Okay, so for those of you who are wondering what the two frameworks were, I posted them in the chat, and we're also going to throw the link up here. The first one that I got to was from Jason Healy. That was the name. It was just escaping me. Who's at Columbia SCYTHE. And he wrote an article on the spectrum of national responsibility. He talks about the different kinds of state sanctions support. And then the other one, which actually we covered on my podcast, Hack the Plant, over at the ICS Village. It was the second episode with Josh Corman, and it's the 5 motivations for hacking. And I believe he calls them the 5 Ps, prestige, etc. And so this, of course, sorry, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah. And I've just on that point in terms of the juxtaposition of cyberpsychology with cybersecurity. I'll just read an extract from the paper, from my paper, which I'll post a link to, which builds on the work of IARPA. And in that, I write that almost a decade ago, Ahmed in 2012 argued that cybersecurity had mostly aligned with technical advancement considerations rather than a psychological approach which could target vulnerabilities of attack vectors. Then McElhaney in 2016 noted that despite the intrinsic psychological nature of many cybersecurity attacks, research into the role of psychology in cybersecurity was very limited. And he added that the research into social engineering had paradoxically mostly been conducted from the discipline of computing rather than the behavioral sciences. And I think that's, it's such a great observation by McElhaney to point that out.
And so, of course, one of the most important parts that we're talking about here is we want to understand the psychology, not only because we can defend, but that's why we have the offensive part in the title, which is going back. How do we frustrate them? How do we get into their OODA loop? How do we impose costs on them? And so I'm going very pithily in the comments. It's a great question that lines it up. What could scare hackers to prevent them to proceed on carrying out cyber attacks?
Okay, so this brings us to the IARPA project. So IARPA understood this gap. And when I was talking about cyber safety, what we're doing in cyber safety, effectively, we were trying to patch, if you will, human vulnerability, to stop attacks in terms of what could be harmful. When we move to talking about IARPA, this is getting into sort of offensive cyber psychology. Now we're going on the attack. We're not patching anything. We're looking for vulnerability, or what IARPA called CogVuls, cognitive vulnerabilities. So the IARPA project specifically focused on decision-making biases and cognitive vulnerabilities. So for example, I'll give you 2 examples: confirmation bias and representative bias. And confirmation bias is sort of that you're following your own hunch and you back it up, and then you go down a particular route. And representative bias is where you put too much weight on something that you think is a phenomenon that represents something else. Now, this is all the higher echelons of psychological judgment and decision-making, which is a very complex area. I suppose the elephant in the cyber room with regard to where IARPA have sort of focused that work is that it's working on a premise that you take these cognitive vulnerabilities and decision making and heuristics that humans make. Every time you make a decision, you're working with, what's called the availability heuristic. So, for example, if there's just been a storm or a typhoon somewhere in South Carolina and somebody says, hey, do you want to go there for the weekend? The following weekend, your rule of thumb is going to be, no, I don't think so, because the storm just blew through. And that's got nothing to do with the probability of another storm. It's a rule of thumb that you use to make a decision. Now, the problem with taking general decision making that applies to across the population, okay, so these are like standardized psychological testing and metrics, and applying that to a very specific group, which is cyber attackers, and let's call them hackers in terms of the personality traits and characteristics we discussed. My argument would be, yeah, but hackers' brains are wired differently. They don't make standard decisions and heuristics and rules of thumb and biases. No, I mean, I've got friends who who are let's call them gray hat to be politically correct, but they don't think like anybody else. Their decision making, the judgments that they take, the routes that they take, it's counterintuitive. So they're wired differently. So once you take premises that are broadly, that you could relate to general population, I don't believe they're going to apply specifically. There may be incidences, but I don't think they're going to be as sort of effective as they could be. So when the IARPA project was launched, and there was this whole teaming process and large sort of US industrial military complex getting involved in the pitching process, I thought, you know what, no, I'm going to go away with a group of scientists and sort of come at it how I, as a cyber psychologist, would come at the problem space, and come back to the profile of the hacker, the cyber attacker. I'm just going to use that interchangeably just because it's handy, and say, let's forget about the things that normal population do in judgment and decision making, and let's go back and tap into the specific psychological vulnerability of a hacker. So we said impulsivity was a trait. So in the paper that I wrote, and the paper is, myself and colleagues, is based on the premise of offensive cyber psychology, active cyber defense, and targeting cognitive vulnerabilities in cyber attacker population, and specifically from an industry point of view. So the paper is called "The Enterprise Strikes Back." Like, we had fun with that. It was like Star Wars meets Star Trek, and effectively, I identified as a cyber behavioral scientist a number of areas that we could counterattack to answer the question specifically. So, for example, impulsivity is a trait in this cohort, your hacker cohort. So what you want to do then is target impulsivity. So you want to keep pressing their buttons in terms of the impulsivity of attack to the point that they burn out. Risk-taking is another trait. And risk-taking is highly correlated to delinquency and criminality. So therefore, you want to push triggers that encourage risk-taking with the view to the attacker slipping up in some context and therefore exposing themselves. Cognitive overload is another attack vector. So what you want to do is seek methodologies to bombard the cyber attacker psychologically in a way that will induce cognitive overload and burnout. Another one which I find fascinating is the premise of reward seeking. So if you look at the work of Pansep in 2004, he hypothesized this notion of reward seeking. And then if we transpose that to technology, let's say, for example, you're searching online. So you're clicking on a link and another link. It's infinity. So you can get lost in a time warp. Did you ever go to check your emails or check something out for 10 minutes before a taxi arrived, and then all of a sudden, like an hour is gone? It's just, you get lost in this, sort of black hole. And the point about that is that the very act of seeking in mammalian species, the reason that we got out of our cave and went forth and looked for berries and green areas or a new cave, is the very act of seeking stimulates the lateral hypothalamus, which actually releases dopamine. So now you've got this reward seeking mechanism. And what you want to do is push that button as well, because the stimulation in the cyber attacker, i.e. the more that they're rewarded, the more arguably the hits that they're getting from, of dopamine, which is in turn pleasure inducing. And in fact, there's a great psychological study using rats, and effectively what they did was they linked up a probe to the lateral hypothalamus of the rat, and every time they pressed a lever, they got a hit, a dopamine hit. And what actually happened was the rats pleasured themselves to death. So they didn't drink, they didn't eat, they just kept hitting the lever. Now, not that we want a cyber attacker to die, but if you can imagine if you had an equivalent whereby there was so much pleasure from perceived success, which is sort of counterintuitive to the idea of creating a wall in terms of your network defense and stopping. There's all sorts of interesting research around, cyber honeypots and Potemkin villages, of allowing somebody in and having perceived success. So that would be an example of that reward seeking and stimulating the lateral hypothalamus to the point that there's pleasure, but to no end. And then we get into the area which, in terms of tackling psychological vulnerabilities, which I think gets like super cool, but like I'm a forensic scientist, so I would think this is cool. So imagine you have a crime scene and you have a body, and to create the profile of the perpetrator, you're looking at the weapon. Did they use a gun? Did they use a knife? If they used a knife, where did they stab? What we call wound pattern analysis. So you can see, you can extrapolate from the crime scene, the body, was the victim bound? Were they tortured? So there's lots of information that you can extrapolate from the crime scene. And in a very large project that I did for Europol, or for the EU, funded by the EU, it was a €5 million project, $5 million equivalent, into human and technical drivers of cybercrime. And for the first time, I conceptualized in that project that what's the weapon at the cybercrime scene? And if we identify the weapon, how do we then create a signature of the crime? And then how do we then make inferences about the psychological profile of the perpetrator in terms of, cyber behavioral profiling? So let's argue that the exploit of choice is the weapon. Now that's really interesting. Is this a gun guy or a knife guy? Is this a ransomware guy or girl, or a, some sort of like spyware? What's the weapon of choice? Because that's going to tell us a lot, hypothetically, about personality traits. So let me explain ransomware. So ransomware is a form of hostage taking. Hostage taking is as old as humankind. But what we do know about those who engage in real world hostage taking is that it's highly correlated with something called the dark tetrad in terms of dark personality traits. The dark tetrad is a cluster of 4 comorbid traits. Somebody who scores high on a scale for Machiavellianism, somebody who scores high on a scale for psychopathic traits, somebody who scores high on a scale for sadistic traits, and scores high on a scale for narcissism. You don't want to date somebody like this. This is a pretty nasty, cocktail. So the paper that looked at dark tetrad, it was entitled "Trolls Just Want to Have Fun." I'll post a link to it afterwards, and they concluded that trolling was a form of functioning sadism or psychopathic traits. So if we go back to ransomware, and ransomware is a form of hostage taking. And increasingly, we're seeing scenarios where medical establishments, hospitals are being subjected to ransomware, where people have died. So if you think about it, your counter in that context, so you're a hospital, you're the subject of a ransomware event, your data has been compromised, or you're locked out, or you're trying to access it, and you're pleading with the cyber attackers to say, people will die, this is terrible. Or you're a small business owner and you're saying, my family, I'm going to go bankrupt, my employees. If you're dealing with a functioning psychopath, they are clinically devoid of emotional affect. They feel no guilt or remorse. And therefore, pleading is not an effective strategy. Don't plead. You're dealing with hostage-taking ransomware. So what you want to do is then target the vulnerability of the psychopathic personality type, which is their narcissism and their impulsivity, and that's what you want to play with. And just to give another and parallel example, let's say the exploit of choice is some sort of, stalkerware, creepware. Then you're not going to say, well, that person is, on a spectrum of, dark tetrad traits. I would argue, as a cyber behavioral profiler, that they're more likely to be on a spectrum of what we call paraphilias. So this is a DSM clinical disorder. And within your paraphilic disorders, you have exhibitionism, so that would be flashing, and voyeurism, which is classic peeping Tom. Is that a pejorative term now?
Or you could be a peeping Tom or a peeping Tina.
Tina. So you have to be so careful. So arguably, if the exploit at the cybercrime scene is in that genre, then you're dealing with somebody who's on this voyeuristic spectrum. So what's your countermeasure then? Your countermeasure is going to be to leverage the paranoia of the voyeur. And that's where you want to start. I mean, they're doing keystroke logging. So you want to start generating chat to say, oh, they're in the system. Yeah, they're in the system. Oh, have we got them? Yeah. Have you got a lock on them? You want them to see that you can see them. The thing the voyeur fears more than anything is the thought of being spied back on. So these are the sort of, this is the range of, and then you've got online disinhibition, the ODE, online disinhibition effect, which dictates that people will do things online that they won't really do in a real world context. And to counter that, and then you get this amplification and escalation of behavior online. So therefore, to counter that, you want to manifest the perception of authority to counter inhibited behavior. So that's a sort of a brief overview of the sort of traits that we might be, and I point out this is hypothetical research, but nonetheless, like, super cool.
So what about the psychology of the defender side? So I thought it was really interesting where you were looking at, with a narcissist basically exploiting their grandiosity.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You lean into it, you flatter them, you work into that world review to get what you want out of it. And they're more than happy to oblige because, again, that's their vulnerability and how it's exploited.
Yeah. And that's your psychological hackback. That's you going beyond the perimeter into their psyche and gaming it.
So this, I think, is a little bit of a pair. I'll throw it at you. We'll see where we go. So this is, again, now asking about the psychology of stress of the defender. This is something I've covered in some of my IANS classes, which is when you're doing incident response planning. One of the things we recommend is actually to have outsourced additional IT support, because your employees still have a full-time job on top of the stress of the response situation. And there are, in fact, providers who specialize solely in reconstructing IT, which is different than the traditional IT management and operations that your personnel have. And so the question here in the comments, what is the psychological status of incident response teams when the incident response plan they have crafted failed to prevent, quarantine the cyber attack? Side effects from this, for example, PTSD, depression, etc.
Yeah. So one of my PhD students, mature students, Eric Mayares, who may be even on this chat, is actually doing his PhD in that. So he's actually looking at cyber defender psychological impact on the cyber defender over time, particularly burnout, particularly PTSD, and what can be done to counter that. So you're talking about a high stress encounter, and then you're talking about the sort of fallout that can come from any unsuccessful and stressful event where somebody has failed. So a wide, range of anything from anxiety to depression to, loss of motivation in terms of your cyber defenders. And the key to, I suppose, to equipping your cyber defenders with the skills to be able to withstand, a failed defense system is to build resilience. So you want to build their psychological resilience. Now, the thing about resilience, it's got a strong hereditary component. So if you have a very harsh situation, let's say it's a war situation and 4 people are captured, one will tend to be and held against their will. One will tend to be naturally very high in resilience, 2 will be 50-50, and 1 will have no resilience. So I would argue that, first of all, you should be, in terms of attracting people into classic cyber defender roles, you should be screening for resilience, because psychological resilience is something that would have protective value rather than trying to triage PTSD after the fact. So then I would focus on enhancing resilience in those who've got some resilience traits but aren't well enough established. I mean, a positive that's come out of the pandemic is that the only way that you can really hone resilience in a natural, like not a, sort of a learned context, is through exposure to adversity. So one positive side of the pandemic and everything collectively we all went through is that we're all a little bit more resilient, psychologically resilient after the fact.
So what you're saying is the management practice of the beatings will continue until morale improves does in fact make you more resilient?
Pardon?
I was being funny. I was saying the
sorry.
management practice of the beatings will continue until morale improves actually builds resilience, because I am providing adversity.
Well, yeah, I think it's that yeah, I think positive encouragement and good practice and education and timeouts and psychological counseling. I think that side of the equation might work better. But I think that the how an organization deals with the failure is down to organizational culture. Some cultures allow people to fail, know that they learn from it, know that they will improve going forward. Some organizations, are horrific in terms of how they treat, their cyber defenders who are faced with what can be a hopeless task in terms of trying to stop the tide coming in.
Well, so conversely, where we're talking about building resilience through
Yeah,
adversity, there's also positive reinforcement, team building, and establishing trust. I think trust is one of the more difficult elements in our industry, because we have a challenge individually and as an industry with explaining what we do, and therefore a lot of folks don't understand, and so there's already miscommunication as a foundational communication fabric. And then on top of that, I think we're a naturally suspicious group,
yeah.
which on the positive side is curiosity, on the negative side is suspicion.
Well, that's
I,
a hacker trait.
I
That
was
is
bringing it up.
that's a hacker trait. I saw a great thing in academia once. It was a T-shirt, and it said, "I can teach it to you. I can't understand it for you." You know, so that's what you're saying, is that, you're dealing in the realm of areas that are very sophisticated and very difficult for people who are non-technical to understand. And very often in a management structure, you might get people at the very top of the organization who really may not understand the complexity of what's happening and how a breach can take place and what the team have done to try to mitigate it or be prepared for it. And therefore you can have like undue consequences for that.
So we've got 3 minutes left, which I think is a great time to transition to what's the next step? Where's the research going to go? As with everything that is empirical science, you have a hypothesis where you think it's going to go, and that's what you're trying to work toward.
Yeah, so the IARPA project is going to go in the direction of IARPA. They're going to look at decision making, and good luck with it. I'm sure they'll find some stuff. I personally, think that more of the solution lies elsewhere, in terms of not, in terms of looking at, first of all, creating a very robust, scientifically robust profile of the hacker personality type. So there's been some work done in this area, but not enough. And even when you see the work that's been done, so like, when entities like IARPA or any other organization goes to test what they're doing, they do like red team, blue team, purple teams with, a whole lot of guys in Arkansas. What's that going to tell you? You know what I mean? It's going to tell you about US mindset and behavior. But the cyber attackers, arguably are not from the US. They may be Russian or Chinese or from China. So how do you create that profile? And then you've got cultural overlay, and then you've got structural overlay. So I would say the research has to go in the direction of actually creating the profile of a cyber attacker in a cultural context. In a cultural context. And we're nowhere near doing that at the moment. And then when you've done that, then you can start experimenting with the 8 to 10 areas that I've laid out and said, okay, how do we then test this? How do we test impulsivity or reward seeking, or further investigate the paraphilia argument? That work. The thing about publishing is that you want people to build on the work.
So when should we circle back up for the next episode that you'll be able to report back on the results?
When anybody on this call decides to fund massive research in the area, this is a call for funding.
Like everything in our space, where's the money to do it?
Yeah, where's the money? And also, I think, though, from the work that's been done to date, people like you, Bryson, that are, developing technologies in this area. I mean, part of my mission is try to influence companies who are in the space, who have funding, who understand that sort of, those human factors piece, who understand the idea of psychological vulnerability and cyber attackers. And for you to, and people like you to engage in the process of, building and testing technologies that actually could offer psychologically hacking back as a service. What does that work out as? Psych hackback. We call it cyber psyops. you've got psychological operations and psychology. This is cyber psyops. So over to you.
Mary, it was a pleasure to have you on the show. And like I said, I think once this is funded and we have results, we should do another one next year to update everybody on what we learned.
Brilliant. Okay.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bryson.
Cheers.
Cheers.